Hey, so today I'm going to start our short lecture by discussing some misconceptions or myths about conflict and communication. So, many people seem to believe that conflict is just miscommunication. So they say that, the reason why people argue is because they just are miscommunicating. They're not getting their message across effectively. And this is simply not true. It's possible to communicate clearly, but still endure conflict. And this is because what really ultimately causes conflict is conflicting goals, right? Or conflicting goals and desires. So, for example, again, I said last time, I gave you the example that my son and I both wanted the last cookie, and so we're going to fight over it. Now, I could communicate very clearly to him, right? I want that last cookie. I want to eat it. I don't want you to have it, right? I could communicate my intentions, my feelings, my desires, my goals very clearly. And this isn't going to help us avoid conflict if his goals are at odds with mine. If he wants to eat that cookie instead of me, well, we're still going to fight about it. So conflict isn't simply the result of miscommunication. So relatedly, people sometimes believe that all conflict can be resolved through good communication. So as a result, we say it's a corollary to the myth of miscommunication. So the truth is that no matter what your communication skills are, not all conflict can be solved by communication. Not all conflict can be resolved by talking through it. As we saw the last time, some goals are inherently at odds. Sometimes, if I want the last cookie and you want the last cookie, we both can't have it. So as a result, no matter how effective we are at communicating, we're not going to solve the basic problem that undergirds or is the heart of our conflict. Now, again, relatedly, we find that some people think it's always better to talk through conflicts. And this is not the case. Indeed, sometimes talking about a point of disagreement just exaggerates the conflict or makes it drag out longer. Right? In fact, sometimes we find that sometimes we'll avoid an argument, we'll avoid a conflict if we just don't talk about it, if we just pretend like it doesn't exist. Maybe you've heard the saying, choose your battles. Now, what someone is really saying when they say choose your battles is sometimes it's better not to address conflict. Sometimes it's better just to leave well enough alone and to move on. And if you never talk about it, it won't become a problem in the future. So talking about things doesn't help, and indeed sometimes can make things worse. All right, so now let's move on and talk about some of the factors that influence conflict. Throughout this book, for every chapter, we've discussed the ways sex and gender impact communication. And when we're talking about conflict, this is no different. Sex and gender play a role. Now, it's important to remember when we're discussing gender, we're talking about gender social. God, I can't say it today. We're talking about gender socialization, not biological sex. So when we're talking about gender, we're talking about masculinity and femininity, what you're supposed to act like, in air quotes, if you're a man or if you're a woman. We're not talking about your actual biological sex. Now, most research suggests that men and women aren't really that different in the way that they deal with conflict. So genetically, right? There's not that much difference between us in the way our body reacts to conflict, right? However, we've been taught a whole bunch of lessons about responsibilities and norms that impact the way that we interact when we experience conflict. So this brings culture to the table, right? There are different cultural practices and norms that can put us in conflict with one another and also impact the way that we engage in conflict with other people, right? So culture plays a major role, and culture also, again, impacts gender, right? Or impacts the gender roles that we're expected to play when we're in conflict with one another. So, for example, men are less likely to cry when involved in conflict, particularly when they're involved in a conflict with another man. Now, you might want to cry if you're a man and involved in conflict, but you probably won't. And the reason you won't is because you've been taught a whole set of norms and responsibilities, right? Men don't cry when they get in a fight, right? So that's culture affecting gender, right? Or impacting your idea of how you're supposed to act in conflict. Now, oftentimes we experience conflict in the workplace that are based on cultural or subcultural differences. Indeed, we know that as far back as 2001, the U.S. workforce was made up of at least 30% immigrants and members of minority cultural groups. So what that means is, right, that when you go out into the workplace, that you're going to be in a really diverse kind of environment, and that you're going to meet people from different cultures, and that indeed the cultural influences, right, the cultural forces that have been in play on you since birth might not be familiar to these other folks, right? And this can cause disagreements or conflicts in the workplace. So it's important to recognize, particularly when you go out into the world and you're in a cosmopolitan environment with a lot of diversity, it's important to realize that all humans want to be respected and shown approval, right? But the ways in which respect and approval are expressed often differ from culture to culture. All right, so the last thing that we're going to discuss today are communication patterns in conflict. So, long-term relational partners, people who've been in relationships for long times, often notice that their communication behaviors form repeating patterns, right? So we get involved in cycles. We get involved in patterns of behavior that repeat again and again and again. It can be really hard to break out of. And these patterns can be negative, right? Or they can be positive, right? They can go either way. Now, one of these patterns that we see is something that's known as symmetrical escalation. So this occurs in conflict when each partner chooses, to increase the intensity of the conflict. This is sometimes called a fight-fight pattern of behavior. So each of you is fighting, and you just are fighting worse and worse and worse. And this can then bring you into an escalatory spiral, right? If you remember that from the previous chapter. Usually this is negative in its intensity, right? It gets worse and worse, and it can't continue forever, right? Eventually it's going to escalate to the point of violence, or to the point where the relationship just sort of combusts, right? It can't go on forever. It's a bad or futile behavior pattern because it doesn't accomplish anything. Now, another negative pattern is known as symmetrical withdrawal. And this is where you get into conflict and you both draw away from the relationship, right? Neither partner is willing to confront the other. And if this is carried out to its logical end, then it results in the dissolution of the relationship. If you're both withdrawing, eventually the relationship will fail. Now, in a pursuit-withdraw style conflict, it's a pattern where one party follows the other, right? One party's trying to keeps pressing the other to talk about what's wrong, right? So that's the pursuit, and then the other partner pulls away, and that's the withdrawal. So let's talk about this. No, I don't want to talk about it. Leave me alone, right? That's the classic pursuit-withdrawal pattern. Then sort of the same pattern, but in another way, is the withdrawal pursuit, and this is where one party pulls away at first, and the other is prompted by this withdrawal to pursue it. So this is, there's very little difference between these two other than which behavior comes first. And these are both what we call asymmetrical patterns, because the partners here are operating in different ways. Now, both these patterns are very unsatisfying to participants. And this brings on what's known as schismogenesis, which is your fancy vocabulary word for the day. In schismogenesis, both partners do what they want to. They both do what they wish the other person would do for them, but they're rebuffed. They're turned away, right? So in a pursuit-withdrawal style pattern, for example, the one person pursues the other to talk about it because they wish the other person would talk about it with them, right? Because this is what they'd want the other person to do if they were in their shoes, but that's not what the other person wants, right? So this is a form then of schismogenesis. Now, what you're really going for, what you want to reach in order to maintain a positive relationship, is symmetrical negotiation. And so this is where each person in the conflict is mirroring the other's constructive negotiation behaviors. All right, that's it for this short lecture. Next time we'll talk about destructive and constructive sides of interpersonal conflict. What's good and bad about it.